My name is Elizabeth. I am 36 years old. On Christmas Eve, my mother-in-law looked me in the eye, slammed her heavy oak door shut, and threw the brass deadbolt. Her voice came through the frosted glass pane, telling me to go sleep in my car. It was 38 degrees below zero in Fairbanks, Alaska. I did not scream. I did not cry. I stood on the icy porch and stared at the unplugged engine block heater cord trailing from my car grill. Without that cord, the engine oil was thick sludge. My car was a metal coffin. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a 10-digit number I had kept secret for 3 months. I told the detective on the other end that the accounting servers were being wiped right now. 20 minutes later, 3 unmarked black SUVs tore up the snow-covered driveway. But the men inside did not come to save me. Before I take you back to the exact moment the trap closed, take a second to like and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories. And drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. The air in the Alaskan interior stops behaving like weather. It strips the heat from your skin and turns your breath into sharp crystals. I stood on the porch staring at the impenetrable oak door. The brass lock had turned with a heavy thud. Through the frosted glass, I watched a shadow shift. Helen walked away, leaving me to the elements. I did not pound my fists against the wood. I did not shout her name into the biting wind, rolling off the Chena River. As a corporate tax accountant, my brain is wired to process variables and assess terminal risk. The risk standing in front of me was severe hypothermia. Fairbanks on a winter night is indifferent to human survival. The darkness wrapped the towering spruce trees in pitch black. I listened to my boots crunch against the hard-packed snow. Down in the driveway, my silver SUV sat parked beneath a flickering halogen security light. Tonight it was a trap. A thick black extension cord trailed from the front grille, resting dead in a snowdrift. The prong was disconnected from the outdoor electrical outlet. In this climate, an engine block heater is a vital mechanism that keeps the oil warm enough to allow the moving parts to turn. Because the cord was unplugged, the fluids inside my engine had congealed into sludge. If I got inside and turned the key, the engine would only click. I would sit on the freezing leather seats, shivering until my core temperature plummeted. I would drift into a lethal sleep before morning. Helen knew this biological reality. Living in the rugged interior, her entire life she knew exactly what an unplugged vehicle meant. Beside my boots sat a waxed canvas sack. 10 minutes prior, Helen had asked me to fetch the 50-pound delivery of raw sled dog meat the supplier had dropped off. She needed the high-fat salmon and caribou mix brought inside, so it would not freeze solid. The outfitting business relied on the animals to pull sleds through the taiga. She prioritized the metabolic needs of her huskies over my own life. The precise moment I stepped over the threshold, the door shut behind me. My heart rate spiked, attempting to push warm blood out to my extremities. The cold was seeping through my wool coat, biting into my thighs. I needed a strategy for survival because the local police dispatch would take too long. A patrol car navigating Chena Hot Springs Road on a holiday night would require at least 40 minutes. I had perhaps 20 minutes before the shivering impaired my motor functions. I pulled my right hand out of my insulated mitten. The frigid air hit my bare skin. My fingers stiffened almost immediately. I reached deep into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. The battery icon flashed yellow. The extreme cold rapidly drains lithium-ion power sources. I typed in a direct line I had memorized 3 months ago. The line rang twice before a tired voice answered. Background noise filtered through the speaker, suggesting a busy bullpen. "It is Elizabeth," I said. My jaw shuddered as the cold rigidified my facial muscles. I am standing on the porch of the lodge. They are wiping the accounting servers right now. The paper ledgers are burning in the wood stove. Silence hung on the line. It replaced bureaucratic hesitation with kinetic focus. Detective Stanton had spent months building a circumstantial profile on the financial irregularities at the business. He knew the servers were the only bridge to an indictment. "Where are you exactly?" he asked. His tone dropped, indicating urgency. "Locked outside," I replied. Engine block is frozen. I watched my breath dissipate into the darkness. You have 20 minutes before the hard drives are formatted and before I freeze. Stay on the porch, he instructed. Keep moving. The line went dead. I shoved my aching hand deep into my mitten. I began to pace the wooden deck, stomping my boots, hard to force the blood back down toward my toes. The silence of the Alaskan wilderness is heavy. There are no sirens. There is no highway hum. There is only the wind rattling the bare birch branches and the restless howling of the 40 huskies chained in the dog yard. I walked back and forth, counting my steps. I performed tax amortizations in my head to keep my brain from slipping into the hazy lethargy of the freezing temperatures. 10 minutes passed. My thighs burned with a dull pain. The sensation in my fingertips receded, replaced by a throbbing ache. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. At 15 minutes, the halogen security light illuminated a sudden flurry of falling snow. I forced myself to keep pacing even as my knees grew stiff. At 18 minutes, the heavy silence broke. The sound of thick tires crushing packed snow echoed up the long, winding driveway. The vehicles drove without sirens, maintaining a stealth approach. 3 unmarked SUVs crested the incline, their headlights cutting harsh beams through the snow. As they shifted into park, their grills flashed to life with strobing red and blue lights. The colors cast frantic shadows against the snowdrifts and the dark log exterior. Doors opened in unison. Heavy boots hit the frozen ground. 5 agents dressed in winter tactical gear moved purposefully toward the porch, their breath forming thick clouds. I stopped pacing. My knees shook, holding my weight as I watched the cavalry arrive. I believed I had survived the lethal trap Helen set for me. I believed my phone call had secured my rescue. But as the lead investigator took the wooden stairs, his eyes did not hold the warmth of a rescuer. His jaw was set tight, and his hand rested near his utility belt. He held the hard, calculating gaze of a man looking at a suspect. The lead investigator did not offer me a thermal blanket or a seat inside the heated cruiser. He stepped right past me on the icy porch and raised a heavy steel ram. The oak door that had stood between me and survival splintered near the deadbolt. The wood fractured with a loud, sharp crack, echoing out into the frozen taiga. The agents flooded the mudroom, their boots tracking thick snow across the heated slate tiles. I followed them inside, stepping over the broken doorframe. A rush of warm air hit my face, bringing a sudden painful prickling sensation to my frostbitten cheeks. The interior of the outfitting lodge smelled of fresh cedar and the distinct acrid smoke of burning paper. They were too late to save the physical ledgers. I expected the agents to secure the premises and usher me to safety as a protected informant. Instead, the hallway door swung open and my husband rushed into the foyer. David did not look like a man caught destroying criminal evidence. He looked terrified, panting heavily as he sprinted out of the back office. David had spent his entire life playing the rugged, capable outdoorsman, relying on his broad shoulders and flannel aesthetic to mask a deep, ingrained reliance on his mother. He bypassed me entirely, ignoring my shivering frame. He went straight toward the detective. He thrust a single crisp sheet of printer paper directly into the chest of the lead investigator. David played his role with terrifying precision. He stammered, pointing toward the back office, claiming he was only following explicit orders. The detective took the paper, holding it up to the harsh overhead light. I watched the investigator's expression harden. It was an email printed directly from the lodge computer. The sender address belonged to my corporate accounting firm. The text mandated the immediate incineration of all tax ledgers, citing an impending audit. The forgery was meticulous, utilizing the exact professional phrasing I used in my daily correspondence. David and Helen had not spent the last hour merely burning evidence. They had engineered a pristine paper trail pointing the finger directly at me. The trap was brilliant in its simplicity. For 5 years, I had managed the financial books for their outfitting business. I held a valid license as a corporate tax accountant. My signature anchored every single S corporation filing they submitted to the state. The Alaska legal system views corporate malfeasance through the unforgiving lens of joint and several liability. The state does not differentiate between the person who stole the funds and the professional who signed the return, validating the theft. By placing my name on those documents, I assumed full fiduciary responsibility. David handed the detective a motive, and my own signature provided the means. The investigator lowered the paper and turned his gaze back to me. The protective barrier I thought I had built around myself evaporated. He did not ask for my side of the story. Law enforcement relies on physical documents over shivering testimonies. He stepped forward, reaching for his utility belt. He grabbed my frostbitten wrists, pulling my arms behind my back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my skin through the thick wool of my winter coat. The steel ratchets clicked tight, locking my hands together. He recited my rights, reading the Miranda warning into the heavy air of the foyer. I looked past his shoulder. Helen stood at the end of the hallway, leaning against the log wall. She watched the officers secure my restraints. She did not gloat or sneer. She simply nodded a silent acknowledgement that she had won the opening battle. I was placed under arrest alongside the very people who just tried to freeze me to death. The agents escorted me out of the warm lodge and back into the unforgiving Alaskan night. They placed me in the back of an SUV. The vinyl seat was hard and cold. The protective cage separating the front and back rows rattled as the vehicle navigated the icy curves of Chena Hot Springs Road. I watched the dark spruce trees blur past the window. My tactical strike had backfired. I called the authorities to stop a crime and handed them the exact architect they needed to close their case. The ride to the city took nearly an hour. The heater in the back of the cruiser barely penetrated the chill, settling deep into my bones. The Fairbanks precinct is a stark, brutalist structure composed of gray concrete and reinforced glass. The booking process stripped away whatever remaining dignity I possessed. Officers processed my fingerprints, capturing the smudged ink on digital scanners. The intake desk confiscated my belongings. Because standard jail protocol categorizes heavy winter outerwear as a potential hazard, they forced me to surrender my thick wool coat, my insulated boots, and my scarf. I was left standing in a thin cotton sweater and denim jeans. The reality of the legal system is sluggish and unforgiving. The calendar dictated my fate just as much as the forged email. It was Christmas morning. The courts were closed. The judges were home with their families. There was no duty magistrate available to set bail. I was trapped in the system until the holiday weekend concluded. A guard escorted me down a long fluorescent-lit corridor. The heavy steel door of a holding cell slammed shut behind me, the electronic lock engaging with a loud, hollow thud. The cell was a barren concrete box measuring 8 feet by 10 feet. A single metal bench protruded from the wall. A stainless steel toilet sat exposed in the corner. The air inside the precinct was climate-controlled, but the concrete radiated a deep, penetrating chill. I wrapped my arms around my chest, sinking onto the rigid metal bench. The physical cold of the wilderness had been replaced by the sterile institutional cold of the penal system. I stared at the cinder block wall, tracing the rough grout lines with my eyes. The adrenaline that kept me functioning on the frozen porch began to fade, leaving behind a crushing wave of exhaustion. I reviewed the events of the night, analyzing every variable. I realized the magnitude of my miscalculation. I treated the situation like a simple tax discrepancy, assuming truth would act as an automatic shield. I underestimated the survival instinct of a family backed into a corner. David sacrificed our marriage in a matter of minutes to save his own skin. Helen orchestrated the diversion, using my professional credentials as a weapon. They utilized my pristine accounting record to legitimize their fraud. The hours dragged on in the artificial light of the holding cell. There are no windows in lockup. Time loses its structure. I listened to the distant sounds of heavy doors opening and closing, the muffled radio chatter of the guards pacing the hallways. My frostbitten fingers ached, a painful reminder of the elements I had just escaped. But the physical pain was secondary to the dawning horror of my legal predicament. If the forged email held up in court, I was looking at multiple felony charges. The state would pursue me for wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. My license would be revoked. I would face years in a federal penitentiary. I sat alone, shivering in the thin cotton sweater, realizing I had locked myself in the exact same legal cage as the abusers I sought to expose. The heavy steel door of my cell remained shut, but the true interrogation had not even begun. The interrogation room measured exactly 9 feet by 9 feet. The walls were painted a dull, institutional beige, designed to offer zero visual stimulation and erode the concept of time. Above me, a single fluorescent tube flickered, casting a harsh, pale tint over the scratched metal table bolted to the floor. I sat in a rigid plastic chair for 7 hours. The detective separated our family the moment we arrived at the precinct. They placed David and Helen in different wings of the building, preventing us from coordinating our stories. I kept my hands folded on my lap, watching the red second hand sweep across the face of the cheap wall clock. My fingers still carried the dull, persistent ache of the frostbite I suffered on the porch. The adrenaline that sustained my survival had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, heavy exhaustion. The heavy steel door swung inward, breaking the monotony of the holding period. A man walked into the room carrying a battered leather briefcase. He looked drained. His suit was wrinkled at the elbows, and dark circles hung beneath his eyes. He introduced himself as a public defender assigned to my case by the duty magistrate. He dropped the briefcase onto the metal table and pulled out a thick stack of yellow legal pads. He did not offer false comfort or gentle reassurances. He sat down, running a calloused hand over his face before looking directly at me. He told me the detectives were not coming in to ask me questions. They did not need a confession from me because they already possessed a complete, cohesive narrative. The public defender opened his manila folder and began reading from a typed transcript. David had not stopped at handing the lead investigator a forged email on the driveway. My husband of 7 years had requested a formal interview the moment he entered the precinct. He sat in a recorded room, waived his right to counsel, and swore under oath that he knew nothing about the fraudulent tax filings. David spun a detailed, intricate lie claiming I wielded autonomous, unchecked control over the outfitting lodge finances. The betrayal deepened as the lawyer turned the page, reading the specifics of the fabrication. To explain the hundreds of thousands of dollars missing from the corporate accounts, David needed a scapegoat. He told the state investigators I suffered from a severe, escalating gambling addiction. He claimed I was funneling the lodge revenue into offshore betting syndicates and hiding the sustained losses within the complex tax amortizations I drafted. David painted himself as the naive, rugged outdoorsman, entirely ignorant of spreadsheets and balance sheets, relying blindly on his brilliant accountant wife. He offered me up as the sole architect of the entire financial collapse. I thought I possessed the emotional discipline to process this information clinically. I expected to analyze his statement, searching for logical fallacies and chronological errors to build a defense. Instead, the shock bypassed my logic entirely. The clinical distance I maintained on the frozen porch shattered into jagged pieces. My chest seized. I tried to pull oxygen into my lungs, but my throat locked tight. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, but my arms gave out under the sudden, crushing weight of the realization. My hand swept across the scratched metal, catching the edge of the lawyer's yellow legal pads. The heavy stack of paper crashed onto the linoleum floor, scattering across the sterile room. I did not react with stoic grace. I did not deliver a sharp, witty comeback, plotting my immediate revenge. I broke down. It was an ugly, guttural release of pure agony. I gasped for air, covering my face with my trembling hands, while hot tears streamed down my cheeks. My nose ran and my shoulders shook with racking, uncontrollable sobs. The public defender sat quietly, allowing the rupture to happen, without interference. The threat of a federal prison sentence faded into the background, overshadowed by the intense, staggering pain of the betrayal. I shared a bed with David for 7 years. I nursed him through bouts of seasonal pneumonia and balanced the books late into the night to keep his mother from losing her land. I loved him. He traded my life for his own, without a single second of hesitation. He built a cage out of my trust and locked the door himself. The criminal justice system does not pause for a broken heart. The legal machinery ground forward with a sluggish, steady momentum. The detectives presented David's sworn statement, the forged email, and my signature on the state tax returns directly to the district attorney. The combination of established motive and documented opportunity provided enough probable cause to bypass a standard preliminary hearing. 2 days later, the state convened a grand jury. The proceedings were swift and secretive, occurring behind closed doors without my presence. Based on the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the grand jury returned a true bill. I was formally indicted on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The duty judge finally set my arraignment and addressed the issue of bail. Because I possessed a valid passport and lacked any prior criminal record, the magistrate granted a high cash bond. I drained the last remaining emergency funds I had kept hidden in a separate digital savings account, paying a local bail bondsman the 10% premium to secure my release. The intake guards returned my clothes in a clear plastic bag. I slipped my arms back into my wool coat and laced up my insulated boots. I walked out of the precinct doors into the blinding midday glare of the Alaskan winter. The cold air hit my lungs like shattered glass. I pulled out my phone, intending to call a taxi and book a cheap extended stay hotel room near the Fairbanks airport to regroup. I opened my mobile banking application to check my available checking balances. The screen loaded, displaying a stark warning message rendered in bold red text. It stated, my account was restricted and instructed me to contact a branch administrator. I tapped the screen, switching over to my professional firm accounts. The exact same restriction message appeared. The reality of my indictment struck another devastating blow. The state prosecutor had filed a civil asset forfeiture motion pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The judge signed an active order freezing every single bank account holding my name or social security number. My personal checking, my emergency savings, my retirement portfolio, and my professional operating funds were all locked behind an impenetrable bureaucratic wall. The state views any asset potentially tied to fraud as evidence stripping the defendant of their financial autonomy until a jury reaches a verdict. I stood on the icy sidewalk outside the police station, staring at the digital zeros on my screen. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small handful of crumpled bills amounting to $24 in physical cash. I had no access to credit lines, no ability to rent a safe apartment, and no professional leverage to secure a loan. The legal trap Helen and David engineered was designed to strip me of my resources before the trial even commenced. They rendered me effectively homeless in a city where the winter temperatures routinely dropped to lethal extremes. I looked down the snow-covered street, realizing I could not fight a multi-million-dollar fraud case from a position of total destitution. I needed shelter. I needed a secure base of operations to decipher the financial ruin they handed me. And I had to find it in the harshest environment in the country, using nothing but the loose change in my pocket. I stood on the icy sidewalk outside the Fairbanks precinct, holding $24 in crumpled bills. The state had locked my financial existence behind an impenetrable bureaucratic wall. I possessed no credit lines and no access to my professional salary. The walk down College Road felt like a slow march into exile. The wind chill pushed the ambient temperature past 40 below zero. My breath crystallized on the edges of my wool scarf, forming a rigid crust of ice against my skin. I needed shelter immediately to survive the impending night. I found a pawn shop with a flickering neon open sign buzzing in the frosted front window. I walked inside and slid my platinum wedding band across the glass counter. The broker was a heavy-set man wearing a thick fleece vest. He did not ask questions about my red-rimmed eyes or my shaking hands. He placed my ring on a small digital scale. He clamped a jeweler's loop to his eye, examining the pristine cut of the diamond I had worn every single day for 7 years. He opened a heavy metal cash drawer and handed me $400 in worn $20 bills. I folded the money into my pocket. I traded the ultimate symbol of my marriage to fund my survival against the very man who placed it on my finger. That cash secured the first and only month of rent for a dry cabin tucked deep in the Goldstream Valley. The valley sits several miles north of the city, serving as a rugged haven for off-grid residents, college students, and people attempting to disappear from society. The cabin was a crude, uninsulated shack built from rough-cut lumber and weathered plywood. It sat at the end of a long, unplowed driveway, surrounded by a dense thicket of black spruce trees. The structure lacked any form of modern plumbing. There were no copper pipes, no stainless steel sinks, and no flush toilets. An outhouse constructed of untreated pine stood 30 yards away in the frozen woods. Using the bathroom required pulling on heavy winter gear and wading through knee-deep snow in the middle of the night. The only source of heat was an ancient cast-iron wood stove squatting in the center of the single room. The air inside the cabin smelled of stale ash, wet wool, and damp decaying wood. Without running water, every drop of liquid required grueling manual labor. Twice a week, I drove my sputtering silver SUV to the local Fox Spring. The natural spring pipes clean water out of the deep permafrost, providing a free source for residents living in off-grid dry cabins. The area around the metal spigot was perpetually coated in a treacherous sloping layer of thick blue ice. I stood in the biting wind, filling heavy 5-gallon plastic jugs. Water weighs over 8 pounds per gallon. Carrying those bulky 40-pound containers across the slick ice and hoisting them into the trunk strained every muscle in my back. My raw hands blistered from gripping the freezing plastic handles. I hauled the heavy jugs back to the shack, dragging them inside just to boil a pot of cheap generic pasta on the flat iron top of the wood stove. My existence shifted from a comfortable, predictable corporate routine into a grueling daily fight for basic biological needs. As a senior tax accountant, my previous life was defined by clean, organized metrics. I spent my days drafting complex corporate depreciation schedules and facilitating commercial mergers in a climate-controlled office overlooking the downtown Anchorage skyline. I drove a reliable vehicle with heated leather seats. I drank expensive espresso imported from Seattle. Now, my reality was dictated entirely by the severe Alaskan elements and the jagged edges of survival. The temperature plunged to 20 degrees below zero and stayed there, locking the valley in a deep freeze. The physical toll was exhausting, but the mental burden was far heavier. The legal battle moved with a sluggish, agonizing pace, designed to break the spirit of the accused. My public defender called from a landline to inform me the judge set my trial date for the second week of November. The date was 11 months away. The criminal justice system operates like a slow-moving glacier. I was trapped in a state of suspended animation. I could not secure employment in my field because the state licensing board suspended my CPA credentials pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. I could not leave the state because my bail conditions required me to surrender my passport to the court clerk. I was marooned in the Goldstream Valley, drowning in the terrifying prospect of facing a decade in a federal penitentiary for a crime I did not commit. One evening late in January, the temperature dropped sharply as a severe high-pressure system settled over the interior. The meager supply of split birch stacked near the door was running dangerously low. If the wood stove burned out during the night, the temperature inside the uninsulated shack would plummet to lethal levels within a few short hours. I pulled on my insulated boots, wrapped a thick scarf around my face, and stepped out into the biting cold to chop more fuel. The darkness was total, unbroken by any artificial streetlights or neighborhood glow. The only illumination came from the pale light of the moon, reflecting off the deep snowdrifts. I dragged a heavy round of birchwood onto the chopping block. I picked up the splitting maul left behind by the previous tenant. The tool was heavy, featuring a thick iron wedge attached to a long wooden handle. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, raised the heavy maul high above my shoulders, and brought it down hard against the center of the birch round. The impact sent a sharp, painful shockwave down my arms. The iron wedge struck the frozen wood, but it did not split the log. Instead, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the silent trees. The force of the strike shattered the wooden handle of the maul right beneath the heavy iron head. The tool broke entirely in half, dropping uselessly into the deep powder. I knelt down, pulling off my right mitten to examine the broken handle. The exterior of the wood had looked solid and sturdy. It appeared capable of withstanding heavy, repeated strikes against frozen timber. But examining the splintered cross-section revealed a different truth. The core of the handle was dark, soft, and brittle. It was rotten from the inside out, hollowed by years of hidden, unseen decay. The sturdy exterior was nothing but a fragile cosmetic shell, masking a terminal structural weakness. I stared at the rotten wood, holding it in my bare hand, as the bitter cold bit into my skin. The broken handle was a perfect, precise reflection of my husband. David presented himself to the world as a rugged, dependable Alaskan outdoorsman. He wore the right heavy flannel shirts, drove the right lifted trucks, and spoke with the quiet, unwavering confidence of a man who could handle any crisis. But beneath his carefully curated surface, his core was weak and decayed. When the extreme pressure of the federal investigation struck his life, he did not stand firm. He shattered. His cowardly interior buckled under the weight of his mother's demands, and he sacrificed me to preserve his hollow facade. The profound weight of the metaphor crushed the last remaining reserves of my strength. I dropped the broken pieces of the maul into the snow. I did not stand up. My legs gave way, and I sank to my knees in the deep powder. The freezing wind whipped through the spruce branches, stinging my eyes and tearing the breath from my lungs. I knelt in the dark woods, overwhelmed by a suffocating wave of intense isolation. The physical exhaustion of hauling water, the terror of the impending trial, the betrayal of my marriage, and the sheer endless cold coalesced into an unbearable pressure. I was a respected corporate professional, reduced to freezing in a dilapidated shack, wondering how I would survive the night without heat. I was drowning in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, staring at a 10-year prison sentence. The silence of the Goldstream Valley offered no comfort and no answers. I wrapped my arms around my chest, burying my face in my thick wool scarf, letting the raw tears freeze against my eyelashes. The snow absorbed the sound of my weeping, leaving me entirely alone in the dark. Surviving in a dry cabin demands calories. The human body burns energy at a frantic pace, simply trying to maintain a baseline core temperature in the interior of Alaska. The ancient wood stove consumed birch logs to heat the air, but I needed dense fuel to keep my organs functioning. I gathered my remaining cash from the pawnbroker transaction and drove my sputtering silver vehicle out of the Goldstream Valley. The suspension rattled over the frozen ruts of the unplowed roads. I steered toward the commercial center of Fairbanks, navigating the sprawling, chaotic parking lot of the local Fred Meyer. The grocery store serves as a vital artery for the isolated communities during winter. It is a harsh intersection of survival and commerce, where residents drag their snow-crusted boots across the wet linoleum floors and strip off their heavy parkas to browse the aisles. The artificial heat and glaring fluorescent lights felt alien after weeks trapped in the dim, freezing shack. I pushed a metal cart with a squeaking front wheel down the canned goods aisle, selecting high-calorie, inexpensive foods. I loaded dried beans, heavy bags of white rice, and generic peanut butter into the wire basket. My focus remained fixed on the strict mathematics of my dwindling budget until a sharp, familiar sound broke my concentration. It was a voice carrying a distinct, authoritative cadence. I paused, stepping behind a tall cardboard display of winter boots, holding my breath. Helen stood near the end of the adjacent aisle. She held the small hand of her 7-year-old grandson, David's nephew. The young boy wore a thick synthetic parka and padded snow pants. A group of rough oil rig workers, smelling of diesel fuel and stale tobacco, pushed past them, laughing loudly and knocking a display of alkaline batteries onto the floor. One of the towering men stumbled close to the child. Helen did not flinch or retreat. She stepped forward immediately, placing her body directly between the towering worker and her grandson. Her posture shifted in a fraction of a second into a rigid defensive stance. She leveled a cold, unblinking stare at the worker, projecting a silent, lethal warning, until the man raised his hands in a quiet apology and backed away. Helen knelt down, adjusting the hood of the boy's parka, her expression softening into a fierce, protective warmth. She was not a cartoonish antagonist operating out of pure malice or petty spite. She was a territorial matriarch guarding her lineage. Watching her shield the boy brought the defining legend of her past rushing into my mind. The outfitting lodge was built on a foundation of profound trauma and physical sacrifice. 30 years ago, Helen and her husband entered the Yukon Quest, a grueling 1,000-mile sled dog race across the unforgiving ice of the Arctic. Near the halfway checkpoint, a freak low-pressure system triggered a lethal whiteout blizzard. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in an hour, trapping them on an exposed stretch of the trail. Her husband succumbed to the elements, his heart failing under the intense biological strain of the cold. Most people would have laid down beside him on the ice and accepted death. Helen refused to die. She unspooled a heavy nylon tow rope, tying one end tightly around her own waist and securing the other end to a small wooden sled holding her toddler son, David. For 2 agonizing days, Helen dragged her child through chest-deep snow. The wind howled, tearing at her exposed skin. Her hands blistered and bled inside her thick mittens, gripping the rope until her knuckles locked. The frostbite claimed the tips of 2 toes, but she kept walking, driven by an animalistic imperative. She dragged her bloodline out of the whiteout and into a rural rescue camp. When she eventually recovered from the severe exposure, corporate investors from the contiguous United States swooped in, attempting to purchase her prime hunting land for pennies. Helen fought them off with the same savage endurance she used on the ice. She built the outfitting lodge with her scarred hands, turning the site of her tragedy into a sprawling, profitable sanctuary. The property was not a simple business venture to her. It was a physical monument to her survival. It was dirt she had purchased with her own flesh. I watched her place a box of oatmeal into her cart, the realization settling heavy in my chest. I turned to walk away, hoping to slip through the checkout lanes unseen and return to the safety of my cabin. The squeak of my cartwheels betrayed my location. Helen turned her head. Her eyes locked onto mine across the sterile, bright aisle. She did not shout or cause a public scene. She did not display the frantic, calculated panic she manufactured on the night of the raid. She told her grandson to wait near the magazine rack. She walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps, her boots heavy against the linoleum. Helen stopped 2 feet away, blocking my path to the exit. The scent of pine and raw cold clung to her coat. Her voice dropped to a low, territorial growl meant only for my ears. She did not waste time with insults or false pleasantries. She looked at my worn clothes, my chapped lips, and my bruised, exhausted face. She told me I never understood the reality of the land or the cost of building an empire in the ice. She spoke with a genuine, terrifying conviction, lacking any trace of remorse. She explained that out here, survival requires brutal mathematics. You cut off a frozen limb to save the heart. She looked me directly in the eye and delivered her twisted logic with chilling clarity. She told me the land stays with the blood. She said I was merely temporary paperwork. Helen continued her quiet execution, standing perfectly still under the fluorescent lights. She told me David was her blood, and the lodge was her sanctuary. When the financial weight of their crimes threatened to crush the outfitting business, she calculated the variables. She saw my corporate license and my signature on the federal tax returns. I was an outsider, a city girl who processed numbers in a heated office. I had not bled into the permafrost. I had not dragged a sled through a blizzard. To Helen, framing me was not an act of cruelty. It was a required amputation. She offered me up to the federal investigators to preserve the sacred legacy she nearly died to build. She truly believed her deceit was a justified moral imperative to protect her own. Helen turned and walked back to her grandson, leaving me standing frozen in the grocery aisle. Her words bypassed my anger and struck a deep, terrifying chord of realization. I was not fighting a greedy corporate embezzler looking for a quick payout. I was fighting a woman driven by a pathological instinct. Helen would never feel guilt. She would never break down in a courtroom and confess. She would lie, cheat, and destroy anyone who threatened the boundaries of her territory because she had already conquered death to claim it. My pristine spreadsheets and professional ethics meant nothing to an adversary who viewed my incarceration as a simple necessary cost of doing business. I pushed my cart toward the registers, my hands trembling against the cold metal handle. The harsh truth of my predicament crystallized as the cashier scanned my cheap groceries. Truth and justice were abstract concepts designed for civilized boardrooms. They held no power against a woman willing to kill her own soul to protect her dirt. I paid for my rice and beans, counting out my remaining cash with stiff, aching fingers. I walked out into the freezing parking lot, knowing my legal defense relied on conventional logic in an environment ruled by primal laws. The sluggish legal system would never penetrate Helen's armor. I loaded the plastic bags into the trunk of my silver vehicle. As the automatic doors of the grocery store slid shut behind me, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. My public defender was calling to demand an emergency meeting at the downtown courthouse. The state prosecutor had finalized their strategy, and the bureaucratic machinery was preparing to offer me a fatal choice. The Rabinowitz Courthouse in downtown Fairbanks is an imposing fortress of glass and steel, designed to make the individual feel small. I sat at the heavy oak defense table, staring at the intricate grain of the wood, while the legal machinery ground my life into dust. The grueling pretrial hearing lasted for 3 agonizing hours. The state prosecutor, a sharp woman wearing a tailored charcoal suit, presented a formidable mountain of circumstantial evidence. She laid out the forged emails, the altered state tax returns, and the sworn affidavits from my husband. She twisted standard corporate accounting practices into deliberate acts of concealment. She projected digital charts onto a large screen, demonstrating how funds moved from the lodge operating accounts into untraceable external holding accounts. She failed to mention that David explicitly authorized every single transfer. She painted a compelling logical picture of a rogue professional accountant exploiting her naive rural family. My assigned public defender shuffled his yellow legal pads, raising weak procedural objections that the presiding judge summarily dismissed. I sat in a rigid wooden chair, wearing a borrowed blazer that hung loose on my shrinking frame. The encounter with Helen at the grocery store echoed in my mind. I knew the predatory reality of the outfitting lodge, but the courtroom did not operate on truth. It operated on documented narratives. My signature provided the prosecution with a pristine paper trail, and they intended to follow it to a conviction. The judge struck his wooden gavel, adjourning the session until the following month. He retreated to his private chambers, leaving the heavy air of the courtroom stagnant. I gathered my sparse notes and followed my public defender out the heavy double doors. We rode the elevator down to the ground floor in a suffocating quiet. The transition from the overheated courthouse to the brutal Alaskan afternoon felt like a sudden physical blow. The sky above Fairbanks hung low and gray, threatening another severe winter snowstorm. The parking lot was a treacherous expanse of dirty slush and black ice. I wrapped my wool scarf tight around my neck, eager to retreat to the freezing isolation of my dry cabin. My lawyer stopped walking a few yards away from my silver vehicle. He set his battered leather briefcase down on the wet pavement. He rubbed his tired eyes, letting out a long, slow breath that formed a thick cloud in the frigid air. He stared at the slush beneath his boots and delivered the fatal blow. The state prosecutor had pulled him aside during the brief recess. They did not want to take this case to a lengthy, expensive jury trial. They wanted a swift, bureaucratic victory. The lawyer explained the terms of the formal plea deal the state was offering. If I signed a full written confession, taking sole responsibility for the financial fraud, the prosecutor would reduce the felony charges. I would serve 18 months in a minimum security federal facility. Following my release, my professional accounting license would be permanently revoked, and I would owe the state restitution. In exchange for my confession, the state would offer David a simple probation agreement. My husband would not serve a single day behind bars. If I refused the offer and forced the state to present their case to a jury, the prosecutor promised to pursue the maximum penalty. Given the dollar amount missing from the outfitting lodge accounts, a guilty verdict carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The lawyer looked up from the slush and told me it was a pragmatic offer. He called it a good deal. He stated that juries despise white-collar crime, and my signature on the state tax returns made me an undeniable target. He advised me to sign the paperwork and accept the 18 months. The human mind can only process a finite amount of sustained terror before the internal architecture collapses. For weeks, I had hauled heavy water jugs across slick ice-split firewood in the dark and starved my own body to afford the rent for a dilapidated shack. I'd endured the bitter betrayal of my marriage and the severe physical toll of the Arctic winter. I maintained a clinical, stoic facade, believing that justice would eventually recognize my innocence. But hearing my own legal counsel refer to a federal prison sentence as a pragmatic solution broke the final remaining pillar of my restraint. The rupture did not arrive as a quiet, tearful surrender. It erupted as pure, unfiltered rage. I was holding a heavy stainless steel travel mug filled with coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I did not yell at the lawyer. I turned toward my own silver vehicle, drew my arm back, and hurled the metal cylinder directly at the windshield. The heavy steel struck the safety glass with a sharp, explosive crack. The impact spider webbed the windshield, sending a sprawling, jagged fracture across the driver's side pane. The mug bounced off the hood and clattered loudly against the wet pavement, spilling dark brown liquid into the dirty slush. My public defender flinched, taking a sudden step backward. I spun around facing him, and the scream tore out of my throat before I could stop it. I screamed into the freezing wind, cursing the profound incompetence of the justice system. I cursed his cowardice for refusing to investigate Helen and her pristine survival narrative. My voice cracked, echoing across the sprawling concrete lot. I yelled that the state was demanding I sacrifice my freedom to protect the exact coward who framed me. I demanded to know why my signature carried more weight than the obvious predatory reality of the outfitting lodge. The lawyer stood paralyzed, gripping the handle of his briefcase. He offered no defense and no comfort. He simply watched the raw, messy explosion of a woman pushed past the boundary of human endurance. The adrenaline surge peaked and vanished, leaving me dangerously hollow. My lungs burned from the frigid air. The fierce anger dissolved instantly into a crushing, suffocating despair. My legs lost their structural integrity. I leaned back against the cold metal door of my vehicle and slid slowly down the side. My knees hit the wet, icy slush soaking through the denim of my jeans. I buried my face in my trembling hands and wept. It was an agonizing, unfiltered breakdown. My shoulders shook with heavy, ragged sobs. The tears flowed hot against my freezing skin, running down my chin and soaking into my wool scarf. My dignity was erased. I sat in a filthy courthouse parking lot, mourning the death of my career, my marriage, and my future. I was an innocent woman, paying the ultimate price for a family that viewed me as a disposable asset. Through the tears, a terrifying internal conflict took root in my exhausted mind. The sheer weight of the impending trial felt unbearable. Fighting Helen required resources I did not possess, and a resilience I was rapidly losing. The plea deal sat on the table, offering a definitive timeline. 18 months in a federal camp was a horrifying prospect, but it was a known variable. A decade in a maximum security penitentiary was a death sentence. I would enter the prison as a 36-year-old woman and leave entirely broken. I would lose my prime earning years, my chance at a family, and any hope of rebuilding a normal life. The sheer mathematical horror of losing 10 years paralyzed my logic. The suffocating anxiety of the unknown gripped my chest. A dark, seductive voice whispered in the back of my mind, urging me to just sign the paper. If I signed the confession, the relentless fear would stop. The grueling court appearances would end. I would surrender my truth, but I would buy a predictable future. I stared at the jagged fracture spider webbing across my broken windshield, realizing the system was designed to manufacture this exact surrender. When the justice system demands you surrender your truth for a lighter sentence, how do you find the courage to risk a decade behind bars? I remained in the slush of the courthouse parking lot until the bitter cold seeped through my jeans and numbed my skin. The tears eventually stopped falling, leaving behind a dry, hollow ache in my chest. I looked at the spiderweb fracture on my windshield. The state prosecutor wanted me to sign a confession out of terror. They wanted to wrap the case neatly and preserve their conviction rate. I realized that surrendering my truth would not buy me a future. It would only validate the narrative my abusers constructed. I pulled myself up off the freezing asphalt. I did not drive to my lawyer's office to sign the 18-month plea agreement. I drove my damaged silver vehicle back to the Goldstream Valley. I decided to weaponize the only remaining asset I possessed. My dry cabin was a freezing wooden box, but it held my salvation. Months ago, before the raid occurred, I had legally retained 3 heavy cardboard banker's boxes of physical accounting duplicates for my own professional portfolio. The Financial Task Force had seized the electronic servers and the primary ledgers from the lodge, but they did not know about my archived copies. I stacked the boxes on the rough wooden floor next to the ancient wood stove. I fed 3 birch logs into the firebox, watching the flames catch. I spread the paper documents across the small laminate dining table. I traded my panic for the cold, calculated logic of a corporate tax audit. I spent the first 2 weeks analyzing the forged internal transfers. The documents detailed hundreds of thousands of dollars bleeding out of the outfitting business into external holding accounts. I focused my attention on the handwritten authorization slips attached to the corporate withdrawal forms. A distinct pattern emerged under the warm glow of my battery-powered lantern. The signatures and the accompanying numerical notes all featured a sharp, left-handed slant. The penmanship belonged unmistakably to my husband. The discovery triggered a blinding surge of betrayal. I assumed David was the solitary mastermind behind the entire financial collapse. He possessed the administrative access to initiate the transfers, and his handwriting anchored the fraud. I focused all my forensic expertise on tracking his movements. I spent long freezing nights huddled under a wool blanket, hunting for non-existent offshore entities. I charted every bank located in territories with relaxed tax laws, hoping to find a shell company registered under his name. I ran complex financial models looking for cryptocurrency conversions or silent real estate investments. The pursuit became an obsession. I burned through my meager supply of firewood and my physical energy chasing his shadow. But the math refused to align. The money leaving the lodge accounts simply vanished into a void. David lacked the sophisticated intellect required to engineer an international money laundering operation. He was a man who struggled to balance a simple household checkbook. I wasted 3 precious weeks, blinded by my own anger, hunting for a phantom fortune that did not exist. The trial clock continued to tick down, and my dead-end investigation left me exhausted and defeated. I sat at the laminate table, staring at a stack of useless spreadsheets. The fire in the wood stove crackled, popping loudly in the silent cabin. I realized I was approaching the audit from the wrong angle. I was looking at where the money went instead of examining how the money entered the shadow economy in the first place. I pushed the corporate transfer slips aside and pulled a thick manila folder from the bottom of the last banker's box. The folder contained the seasonal payroll records and the employee tax files for the outfitting lodge. I traced my finger down the columns of printed data, reviewing the hourly wages of the young men and women hired to handle the sled dogs. The work was brutal, demanding long hours in freezing temperatures for minimal pay. I stopped on a specific wage form belonging to a Yupik dog handler named Thomas. I remembered Thomas clearly. He was a quiet, hardworking teenager from a remote coastal village who lived in the bunkhouse behind the dog yard. I cross-referenced his employment dates with the corporate payroll ledger. A glaring discrepancy jumped off the page. Thomas was fired for alleged insubordination in late August. His final paycheck was issued and cashed before the first snowfall. Yet the internal accounting ledger showed a substantial deposit credited to his specific employee identification number in early October. The deposited amount was immediately followed by an identical withdrawal, labeled as a housing garnishment. I grabbed a fresh legal pad and my pen hovered over the paper. I pulled the files for 5 other seasonal Native Alaskan employees who worked at the lodge during the past 3 years. Every single file contained the exact same anomaly. A mysterious deposit appeared in their accounts in October, long after their seasonal contracts expired. The funds were instantly drained and categorized as room and board fees. I stared at the specific dollar amount of the October deposits. The number was not a random calculation. It matched the exact payout figure of the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend for that specific tax year. The true nature of the crime materialized in the dim light of my cabin. The revelation was so severe it made my breath catch in my throat. Every year, the state of Alaska distributes a portion of its oil revenue to every eligible resident. The dividend payout is a crucial economic lifeline for rural citizens. Helen had engineered a predatory company town scheme designed to harvest this specific state wealth. She targeted vulnerable teenagers from remote villages, offering them seasonal employment and free winter housing at the lodge. When they arrived, she forced them to sign convoluted employment contracts. Buried deep in the legal terminology was a clause granting the lodge the authority to act as their financial sponsor for the state dividend. The contract allowed Helen to intercept their payments directly from the state treasury. She weaponized the housing agreement, garnishing the entire dividend to cover exorbitant retroactive fees for the bunkhouse they slept in. David was not the mastermind. His distinct handwriting on the transfer slips was merely a mechanism. He was the obedient pen executing the orders. Helen was the true architect of the devastation. She trapped her seasonal workers, stealing the very funds meant to sustain them through the harsh winter. She laundered the intercepted state money through the outfitting lodge accounts, funneling the untaxed cash into her own hidden reserves. She viewed the native employees just as she viewed me. We were expendable resources meant to be drained and discarded to preserve her sacred territory. My perspective shifted fundamentally. The fear that had paralyzed me in the courthouse parking lot evaporated. The state prosecutor believed they were dealing with a simple case of corporate tax evasion, orchestrated by a greedy accountant. They were fundamentally wrong. The spreadsheets sitting on my rough wooden table elevated the crime to a terrifying new tier of the justice system. By forging the signatures of the seasonal workers to intercept government funds, Helen committed systemic identity theft. By routing the stolen state dividends across banking lines, she committed severe federal wire fraud. I possessed the exact arithmetic required to dismantle her survival narrative. I had the dates, the employee identification numbers, and the corresponding garnishment records. I mapped the entire predatory ecosystem she built in the shadows. The evidence proved I was not the beneficiary of the stolen wealth. I was merely the blind accountant authenticating the fraudulent ledger. I gathered the employee files and placed them carefully back into the manila folder. I watched the winter sun rise over the frozen tree line, casting a pale golden light through the frosted window pane of my cabin. The truth was finally in my hands. Now I had to find a way to make the rigid, sluggish justice system look at the math. The sun breached the frozen horizon late in the morning, casting a pale, weak light across the Goldstream Valley. The temperature held steady at 30 degrees below zero. I sat in the driver's seat of my battered silver vehicle, letting the engine idle for 20 minutes until the heater blew a faint stream of warm air. On the passenger seat rested a thick black binder containing my meticulously organized spreadsheets. I had spent countless hours cross-referencing every employee identification number against the state dividend payout dates. I mapped the exact trajectory of the stolen funds from the state treasury into the shadow economy of the outfitting lodge. My raw, blistered fingers gripped the steering wheel as I navigated the treacherous, ice-covered roads back toward civilization. I carried a profound sense of grim determination. I believed I held the key to my exoneration. The truth was written in the strict, unyielding arithmetic of forensic accounting. I drove into downtown Fairbanks, parking in the same slush-filled lot where I had shattered my windshield days prior. The jagged fracture spider webbing across the glass served as a stark reminder of the stakes. I clutched the heavy binder to my chest, bypassing the metal detectors, and taking the elevator to the administrative floors of the Rabinowitz courthouse. My public defender, waiting in the corridor, managed to secure a brief impromptu meeting with the state prosecutor. We sat in a sterile conference room, enclosed by frosted glass partitions. The prosecutor wore the same tailored charcoal suit, projecting an aura of rigid bureaucratic authority. She sat across the polished mahogany table, folding her hands and waiting for my presentation. I opened the binder and walked her through the architecture of the scheme. I did not raise my voice or allow my desperate emotions to bleed into the numbers. I spoke the clinical, precise language of a licensed corporate tax accountant. I pointed to the seasonal payroll records of the U-Pick dog handlers. I showed her the discrete ledger entries marking the dates of their termination, followed by the inexplicable deposits occurring in October, coinciding perfectly with the Alaska Permanent Fund disbursement schedule. I tracked the immediate garnishment of those exact sums diverted into the lodge operating accounts under the guise of retroactive housing fees. I laid out the stark arithmetic proving Helen engineered a predatory system to intercept government funds, and David forged the internal transfer slips to launder the cash through the business. The state prosecutor listened in silence. She spent 10 minutes reviewing the printed spreadsheets, tracing her manicured finger down the columns of numbers and cross-referencing my data points. I watched her face, expecting the rigid lines of her expression to soften into realization. I expected her to summon the lead investigator and issue an immediate warrant for Helen's arrest. Instead, she closed the heavy black cover of the binder. She pushed it back across the smooth wooden table toward me with a slow, deliberate motion. She looked at my public defender and then shifted her sharp gaze back to me. She acknowledged that my theory was intricate and highly detailed. Then she delivered a crushing dose of legal reality. She explained that the justice system does not operate on theoretical math or printed spreadsheets generated by an indicted suspect. To a jury, my meticulous binder was nothing but circumstantial speculation. She reminded me of my professional credentials. As the licensed corporate tax accountant on file, I possess the exact technical skill set required to fabricate these documents from scratch. The state viewed my presentation not as a revelation of truth, but as a desperate, calculated attempt to deflect guilt onto my rural in-laws. I sat stunned, gripping the edge of the table. I argued that the numbers aligned perfectly with the state treasury disbursements and the seasonal contracts. The prosecutor shook her head, dismissing my logic. She clarified the severe burden of proof required in a federal wire fraud and identity theft case. To dismantle my signature on the official state tax returns, the prosecution required hard physical evidence. They needed the original source documents. They needed the physical shadow ledger detailing the exact banking routing numbers used for the illicit transfers. Most importantly, they needed physical paperwork, bearing Helen's verifying initials alongside David's forged authorization signatures. Without that specific, tangible ledger tying Helen directly to the stolen money, my spreadsheets were entirely useless in a court of law. Panic flared in my chest, tightening my throat. I leaned forward, demanding she dispatch the financial crimes unit back to the outfitting lodge. I told her the shadow ledger existed, and Helen was hiding it somewhere on the sprawling rural property. I urged her to draft a new search warrant immediately before the winter ground thawed and gave them a chance to bury or incinerate the remaining evidence. The prosecutor let out a slow, exhausted sigh. She leaned back in her leather chair and outlined the rigid boundaries of the Fourth Amendment. A federal judge requires establishing firm probable cause before authorizing an armed raid on private property. The unverified printed math of a woman facing a decade in prison does not meet the legal threshold for probable cause. The state was explicitly denying me the judicial mechanism required to retrieve the proof of my innocence. They refused to search the property, based on my word alone, and they refused to drop the charges without the physical ledger they refused to look for. The bureaucratic wall was impenetrable. The justice system demanded I provide the weapon used against me, but forbade me from stepping onto the battlefield to retrieve it. The state prosecutor stood up, signaling the end of our allotted time. She gathered her legal pads and offered a final piece of advice before walking out the frosted glass door. She suggested I listen closely to my appointed counsel regarding the pending plea agreement. My public defender and I walked out into the echoing marble corridor of the courthouse. The brief spark of hope I carried from my freezing dry cabin was extinguished, leaving a cold, hollow void in my stomach. I was boxed into a terrifying logistical nightmare. I knew exactly how Helen executed the fraud. I knew exactly how to clear my name and expose the predatory company town scheme. But the truth was trapped behind a legal barrier I could not breach. My lawyer stopped near the elevator banks. The deep exhaustion etched into his features mirrored my own physical drain. He did not possess the resources, the private investigators, or the authority to fight a state prosecutor who had already solidified her narrative. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a folded document. It was the formal 18-month plea deal, printed on heavy bonded paper. He handed the document to me. The weight of the paper felt heavy in my numb hands. He spoke in a low, urgent tone, outlining the shrinking timeline. The judge had finalized the trial docket. The dates were rapidly approaching, and the prosecution was finalizing their witness list. The leniency offer was not an open-ended invitation. The state prosecutor had attached a strict expiration date to the agreement. The document in my hands would become null and void on Friday at 5 p.m. He looked at me with genuine pity. He begged me to separate my pride from my survival. He reiterated the harsh mathematics of a jury trial in the Alaskan interior. If we walked into that courtroom without the physical shadow ledger, my pristine spreadsheets would be torn apart piece by the prosecution. The jury would look at the defense table and see a sophisticated city accountant attempting to blame a hardworking widow and her loyal son. The guilty verdict was a statistical certainty, and the mandatory 10-year sentence would destroy the rest of my adult life. He urged me to sign the paper, take the 18 months in a minimum security camp, and walk away before the trap crushed me beyond repair. I stood in the cold marble hallway, staring at the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. The deadline gave me exactly 4 days to manufacture a miracle or surrender my freedom forever. The severe Arctic freeze broke late on Wednesday afternoon. A rogue warm front pushed into the interior, turning the deep snowpack into a treacherous layer of wet, heavy slush. The temperature hovered just above freezing, creating a damp, miserable chill that penetrated deeper than the sub-zero dry cold. Water dripped from the metal roof of my cabin, forming muddy puddles around the frozen chopping block. The driveway turned into a slick, impassable mire of brown ice and dirt. I sat at the laminate table, staring at the printed plea agreement. The expiration deadline was 48 hours away. The paper felt heavy, acting as a stark physical manifestation of my impending ruin. The sound of thick tires grinding through wet gravel pulled my attention to the frosted window pane. A familiar black truck idled in my driveway, its exhaust forming pale clouds in the damp air. The driver's side door opened. David stepped out into the freezing mud. He did not look like the confident, rugged outfitter who handed me to the authorities on Christmas Eve. He looked shattered. His heavy canvas jacket was stained with dark motor oil and dried dog blood. Deep hollow shadows carved dark circles beneath his bloodshot eyes. His hands trembled as he pushed the heavy truck door shut. He looked like a man drowning in the very trap he helped construct. I opened the cabin door before he could knock. The cold, damp air rushed inside, carrying the sharp scent of melting pine needles. David stood on the threshold, shivering. I did not invite him in, but he stepped past me, bringing the smell of wet wool and stale coffee into the cramped space. He collapsed onto the worn fabric of my second-hand couch. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his calloused hands. The silence between us stretched heavy and thick. He spoke in a hoarse, fractured whisper. He told me the outfitting lodge was collapsing under the weight of the federal probe. The investigation had triggered a cascade of panic within their shadow economy. Helen was unraveling, succumbing to a severe territorial paranoia. David described his mother pacing the sprawling property at night, carrying a loaded rifle, accusing everyone from the dog handlers to the local delivery drivers of working for the government. He claimed he was trapped hostage to a woman rapidly losing her grip on reality. He lifted his head to look at me. His eyes swam in unshed tears. He deployed every psychological tactic he had honed over our 7-year marriage. He knew exactly how to leverage his vulnerability. He begged me to save him from the nightmare. He pointed a trembling finger toward the uncompleted plea agreement resting on my table. He pleaded with me to sign the document and accept the 18-month sentence. He promised a fabricated future painting, a desperate picture of redemption. David swore that if I took the fall and absorbed the federal charges, he would finally sever the toxic tether binding him to his mother. He promised he would wait for my release from the minimum security camp. He outlined a meticulous plan to leverage his remaining legal authority to transfer half the equity of the outfitting lodge directly into my name. He offered a fresh start far away from the brutal Fairbanks winters, funded by the very dirt Helen bled for. The manipulation struck a deep, resonant chord inside my exhausted mind. The love I harbored for him was not a superficial illusion. It was built on years of shared quiet moments and presumed trust. I remembered nursing him through a brutal bout of seasonal pneumonia, staying awake for 3 consecutive nights to monitor his fever while the snow piled high against our bedroom window. I remembered the man who built a custom wooden greenhouse for my summer tomatoes, sanding the cedar planks by hand. Seeing him sitting on my couch, broken and weeping, attacked the final remaining walls of my empathy. The physical toll of hauling water and chopping wood in the dry cabin, combined with the sheer terror of the impending trial, weakened my resolve. The pen resting next to the legal document felt incredibly heavy. Signing the paper would end the agonizing uncertainty. It would stop the relentless, grinding fear of a 10-year sentence. It would offer a tangible timeline for my suffering. I closed my eyes, taking a long, ragged breath of the damp cabin air. I reached across the laminate table, allowing my fingertips to brush the smooth plastic barrel of the ballpoint pen. I picked it up, rolling it between my thumb and index finger. David let out a shallow breath he had been holding. He leaned forward, shifting his weight to the edge of the couch cushions. His face shifted into an intricate mask of profound relief and raw gratitude. As he moved his posture, the thick canvas collar of his stained jacket shifted outward. The heavy fabric pulled away from his flannel shirt, exposing a dark gap near his collarbone. Deep inside the layered clothing, a faint, rhythmic red light pulsed in the dim shadows. The illumination was tiny, sharp, and unmistakable. It blinked in a steady, calculated sequence, right over his heart. My thumb paused on the click mechanism of the pen. The crushing wave of empathy halted, evaporating in a single fraction of a second. The red light was the digital heartbeat of a concealed audio transmitter. David did not drive out to the Goldstream Valley to apologize or resurrect our fractured marriage. He did not come to escape his mother or offer me a portion of his legacy. He came functioning as an active informant for the state prosecutor. The prosecution lacked the physical shadow ledger required to convict me. The attorneys knew my trial possessed critical vulnerabilities without a direct confession. They dispatched my husband wearing a wire to extract the final piece of their legal puzzle. David sat in my living room, weaponizing our shared history, utilizing his manufactured tears to goad me into a recorded admission of guilt. He intended to walk out of my cabin and hand my recorded voice directly to the authorities, trading my decade in a federal penitentiary for his own permanent immunity. I stared at the pulsing red diode hidden beneath the canvas. The ultimate betrayal performed an instant, irreversible alchemy within my chest. The residual warmth, the lingering doubt, and the paralyzing fear turned into a cold, hardened armor. The man weeping on my couch was not a victim of a dominant matriarch. He was a hollow, calculated predator, willing to wear a recording device to execute his own wife. He weaponized my empathy, turning my best traits into a lethal liability. I set the pen down on the table, leaving the signature line blank. I stood up, towering over his seated, shivering frame. I did not scream or hurl accusations regarding the hidden microphone. I required him to believe his deception remained intact. The state prosecutor demanded I supply the weapon used against me. I looked at David, realizing the sluggish justice system would never penetrate Helen's fortress through conventional means. If the authorities were willing to use my husband to lay a trap, I would have to bypass the law entirely and build a trap of my own. I stepped back from the couch, putting physical distance between myself and the blinking red diode hidden beneath his coat. I did not scream. I did not hurl accusations or shatter the fragile illusion of his deception. A sudden erratic outburst would only provide the state prosecutor with the exact chaotic audio recording she desired. Instead, I walked across the small room and gripped the iron handle of the cabin door. I pulled it open, letting the damp, freezing wind sweep inside. I stood in the doorway and pointed out toward his idling truck. I did not speak a single syllable. David opened his mouth, attempting to deploy another fabricated tear or a hollow plea, but the sheer weight of my silence suffocated his words. The absence of my anger terrified him far more than a physical strike ever could. He looked into my eyes and realized the empathetic wife he came to exploit was gone. He stood up, his posture shrinking, and hurried past me out into the dark slush. I closed the door the moment his boots hit the gravel, listening to the heavy engine of his vehicle accelerate down the treacherous valley road. The cabin suddenly felt like a shrinking wooden tomb. The damp walls pressed inward, carrying the lingering scent of his betrayal. I could not remain in that isolated shack for another minute. I grabbed my car keys and the unsigned plea agreement, driving away from the Goldstream Valley. The unplowed roads were a chaotic mess of brown ice and deep ruts. I steered toward the industrial edge of Fairbanks, seeking the harsh, artificial glow of civilization. I parked outside a 24-hour diner, a neon sign buzzing erratically above the frosted front windows. The interior smelled of burnt coffee fried grease and industrial bleach. I slid onto a red vinyl stool at the far end of the sticky laminate counter. The late-night crowd consisted of weary long-haul truckers and insomniac shift workers. I placed the federal plea document on the counter in front of me. The crisp white paper looked entirely out of place next to the cheap ceramic sugar dispensers. I stared at the blank signature line, the heavy burden of the impending Friday deadline pressing down on my chest. 2 stools down, an older man sat hunched over a thick ceramic mug. He was a classic Alaskan sourdough, a term reserved for the rugged locals who have endured decades of brutal interior winters. He wore a faded red flannel shirt and a canvas ball cap stained with engine grease. Deep weathered lines mapped his face, telling a silent history of surviving elements that routinely break lesser men. He did not possess a law degree or harbor any secret forensic knowledge. He was simply a man drinking bitter black coffee at 2 a.m. He glanced sideways, noticing the rigid posture of my shoulders and the formal legal document resting under my trembling hands. He did not ask for my life story or offer unsolicited pity. He took a slow sip from his mug and directed his gaze toward the dark, frosted window facing the highway. He remarked on the false warm front that had turned the snow into miserable slush. He spoke in a gravelly, low cadence, noting how the sudden midwinter melting tricks new residents into believing the worst is over. He turned his weathered face toward me, setting his mug down on the scratched laminate. He explained that the slush always freezes solid again, trapping anyone foolish enough to drop their guard. He told me he lost his younger brother to the deep freeze decades ago because the boy trusted a temporary break in the weather instead of preparing for the inevitable drop. The old man leaned forward, resting his scarred, calloused forearms on the counter. He delivered a grounded, unpretentious truth earned through years of harsh survival. He said you never survive the interior by waiting for the thaw to save you. He told me the cold is patient and it always returns. If you want to stay warm, you have to chop your own wood. He turned back to his coffee, returning to his quiet isolation. He had no idea he was speaking to an indicted tax accountant facing a decade in federal prison. He was merely sharing the fundamental arithmetic of staying alive. The metaphor struck me with the force of a physical blow, snapping the invisible chains of my emotional paralysis. For months, I had been waiting for the sluggish justice system to initiate a thaw. I relied on my public defender to rescue me. I waited for the state prosecutor to recognize the logical truth of my spreadsheets. I even waited for my husband to experience a miraculous moral awakening. I was sitting in the cold, hoping the external elements would change to ensure my survival. The old sourdough was right. The federal government was never going to save me. Helen and David were never going to relent. Signing the plea agreement was not a tragic romantic sacrifice meant to spare me from a lengthy trial. It was an act of total pathetic surrender. It meant laying down in the snow and letting the cold take me. If I wanted to clear my name and expose the predatory reality of the outfitting lodge, I could not wait for the authorities to hand me a warrant. I had to bypass their bureaucratic barricades and chop my own wood. A profound clarifying energy rushed through my veins. The suffocating anxiety that plagued me since Christmas Eve vanished, leaving behind a cold, tactical focus. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved the blue ballpoint pen. I did not pull the plea agreement closer. I reached for a cheap, thin paper napkin resting under my coffee cup. I clicked the pen and wrote my full name across the flimsy paper in bold, defiant letters. I slid a crumpled $5 bill under the signed napkin, leaving it for the tired waitress. I picked up the formal 18-month federal plea agreement. I did not fold it carefully. I stood up from the vinyl stool, walked toward the exit, and dropped the crisp, legal document directly into the greasy metal trash can stationed by the front doors. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping back out into the damp, freezing Alaskan night. I did not possess a badge, a search warrant, or a team of armed investigators. I was a disgraced corporate accountant, stripped of my credentials and abandoned by my legal counsel. But I possessed intimate operational knowledge of the rural property that trapped me. I knew the specific layout of the outfitting lodge, and I understood the paranoid psychology of the woman guarding it. Helen believed her fortress was impenetrable to conventional law enforcement. She was correct. The state would never breach her walls without physical proof. I walked toward my damaged silver vehicle, formulating a meticulous tactical maneuver designed to exploit the very state laws that bound me. I had to infiltrate her sanctuary, retrieve the shadow ledger, and hand it to the authorities on a silver platter. I just needed 30 minutes of legal access to the property, and I knew exactly which civil loophole to pull. I bypassed the criminal courts and utilized the family law division to construct my Trojan horse. The Alaskan Legal Code contains specific provisions designed to prevent domestic fatalities during brutal winters. Under state law, a spouse facing sudden separation possesses the right to a one-time civil standby. It is a strict 30-minute window where an armed state trooper escorts the displaced individual into a shared residence to retrieve essential survival gear. You cannot legally deny a spouse access to heavy coats and boots when the temperature drops below zero. I walked into the clerk office on Thursday morning and filed the injunction. A local magistrate rubber-stamped the request, viewing it as a routine dispute. I met the assigned officer at a rural highway junction. The trooper was a veteran, wearing a heavy tactical vest. His expression projected deep, weary boredom. He viewed this assignment as a tedious chore, babysitting a bitter wife trying to salvage sweaters from a failed marriage. He possessed no knowledge of the federal probe, the forged tax returns, or the stolen state dividends. He was merely a blunt instrument of the civil court, and I needed his badge to pry open the doors of the lodge. We drove up Chena Hot Springs Road. The brief warm front had vanished, leaving a solid sheet of black ice over the asphalt. The winter landscape looked barren and unforgiving under the heavy gray sky. The cruiser pulled into the long driveway, parking near the spot my vehicle had frozen solid months prior. The towering spruce trees cast dark shadows across the snow. I stepped out of my car and walked up the wooden steps alongside the heavy boots of the trooper. He did not knock gently. He pounded his gloved fist against the oak. David opened the door. The sight of the uniformed officer drained the color from his face. He stammered, taking a step backward into the warm foyer. Helen materialized from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a canvas apron. Her eyes locked onto mine, burning with fierce territorial rage. The trooper did not give her a chance to speak. He held up the court order declaring my legal right to enter the premises. He established the rigid parameters of the visit, stating I had exactly half an hour to collect my belongings without interference. He rested his hand casually near his service belt, projecting an unspoken warning. Helen and David were furious but legally paralyzed. I crossed the threshold. stepping onto the heated slate tiles. The air inside the lodge smelled of fresh coffee and burning cedar. It was a stark, agonizing contrast to the damp, freezing decay of my dry cabin nestled deep in the isolated valley. I did not hesitate or look around the main living area. I walked straight down the corridor toward the primary bedroom I once shared with my husband. Helen followed right on my heels, her boots striking the floorboards with a heavy, rhythmic thud. The trooper trailed a few paces behind us, keeping a watchful eye on the tension. As I opened the bedroom door, Helen began her psychological assault. She dropped her tone to a venomous whisper, designed to pierce my remaining defenses without alerting the officer. She hovered near my shoulder, mocking my worn clothing and the dark circles under my eyes. She called me a stupid city girl who would freeze in a concrete cell. She promised that my pristine accounting degree would not protect me from the federal camp. She projected a total, unwavering victory, believing she had successfully amputated the infected limb from her family tree. I let her speak. I kept my head down, playing the role of the defeated, broken woman. I opened the closet door and pulled out a large canvas duffel bag. I began transferring thick wool sweaters, thermal base layers, and fleece pants from the shelves into the bag. My hands trembled, mimicking profound fear. But beneath my silent facade, my mind was executing a cold, calculated forensic audit. The scene bled with thick, dramatic irony. Helen stood 2 feet away, hurling insults, unaware that I was not there for the clothing. During my endless freezing nights in the valley, I had scrutinized the physical banker's boxes containing the lodge operating expenses. Alongside the payroll records, I found a recurring vendor receipt that defied all logical business metrics. Every single month, the outfitting lodge paid exactly $5,000 to a premium sled dog meat supplier. I knew the metabolic requirements of the 40 huskies chained in the backyard. A legitimate rural outfitter feeds their working animals a mixture of bulk frozen salmon scraps and cheap high-calorie dry kibble. The actual monthly cost to sustain that pack amounted to a fraction of that exorbitant figure. The inflated feed budget was the smoking gun. It was the crucial mathematical flaw in her pristine survival narrative. Helen was not buying premium meat. The fake invoices served as a crude, brilliant laundering front to hide the stolen permanent fund dividend cash. She generated fraudulent expenses to drain the corporate accounts, ensuring the intercepted government funds disappeared from the official tax ledger. The stolen wealth did not travel through complex offshore banking channels. It went straight out the back door and into the dog yard. I knew exactly where the physical shadow ledger and the stolen cash were hidden. The trooper checked his heavy wristwatch, breaking the tense silence. He announced we had exactly 15 minutes remaining on the civil standby mandate. I zipped the canvas duffel bag shut. It was heavy, filled with enough winter gear to satisfy the visual requirements of the court order. I slung the thick strap over my shoulder. Helen stood perfectly still in the bedroom doorway, her arms crossed tight over her chest. A smug, satisfied expression etched deep into her weathered face. She firmly believed the threat was neutralized. She was unknowingly standing right on the precipice of her own destruction. I walked past her, feeling the heat of her glare against the side of my face. But I did not turn left toward the foyer and the front exit. I pivoted right, heading straight down the narrow utility corridor leading to the rear mudroom. Helen stepped forward, her smug facade slipping as genuine confusion registered in her dark eyes. She demanded to know where I was going, claiming I had already cleared out my closet and gathered everything I needed to survive the winter. I looked at the state trooper, who was raising a skeptical eyebrow at my sudden change in direction. I kept my voice calm and steady, projecting a practical necessity. I told the officer I needed my insulated coveralls and my thick Arctic boots. I stated they were stored outside in the exterior feed shed next to the heavy equipment. The trooper nodded, signaling his approval to proceed to the outbuilding. Helen let out a sharp, panicked breath. The confrontation shifted rapidly, away from the sterile confines of the bedroom, moving directly toward the chaotic, howling expanse of the frozen dog yard. I pushed open the heavy rear door, stepping out into the biting wind, ready to spring the trap. Stepping out the rear door of the mudroom felt like walking into a wind tunnel of ice and feral noise. The temperature outside had plunged back into the -20s, freezing the slush from the previous day into jagged, treacherous ridges of brown ice. I stepped onto the uneven ground, ignoring the biting chill pulling at my face. Ahead of me, the dog yard sprawled across a half-acre of cleared taiga. Over 40 Alaskan Huskies were chained to individual wooden houses spaced in strict geometric rows. The moment my boots hit the frozen gravel, the entire pack erupted. The noise became a tangible force. 40 deep, resonant howls tore through the crisp winter air, blending into a deafening, chaotic chorus that vibrated deep within my chest. These were not household pets. They were working animals bred for endurance and raw power, and their frantic energy fed the rising tension. I marched straight down the narrow center aisle between the rows of barking dogs. The thick canvas duffel bag bounced against my hip. I did not look left or right. I kept my eyes fixed on the low-profile insulated feed shed sitting at the far edge of the tree line. Behind me, the dynamic shifted in an instant. Helen realized my trajectory. Her smug armor cracked, falling away to reveal pure, unfiltered panic. She sprinted down the wooden stairs of the back porch, her boots slipping on the icy treads. She shouted my name, her voice cracking and straining to cut through the deafening roar of the Huskies. She demanded I stop. She yelled to the state trooper that the shed was strictly off-limits, citing insurance liabilities and dangerous equipment. The officer did not slow his pace. He placed a hand over his holster and maintained his steady stride, following my exact path through the canine chaos. I reached the feed shed and grabbed the iron handle. The thick wooden door groaned as I pulled it open. The interior was dim-lit, only by a single bare bulb hanging from the exposed rafters. The air inside hit my lungs like a blunt force. It was kept near freezing to preserve the inventory and carried the overpowering scent of raw fish, dried blood, and cold caribou fat. Stacks of rusty tools, thick steel chains, and broken sled runners leaned against the plywood walls. I ignored the equipment. I dropped my duffel bag onto the dirt floor and walked directly to the back corner of the room. A towering stack of burlap sacks and dense plastic bags dominated the space. These were the premium feed bags listed on the forged invoices I had studied in my freezing cabin. I fell to my knees on the hard dirt. I grabbed the coarse fabric of the top bag and yanked it backward with all my remaining strength. The bag weighed at least 50 pounds, packed tight with frozen salmon heads and fish scraps. It hit the floor with a dull, weighty thud. I grabbed the next bag and threw it aside, tearing my fingernails on the rigid plastic. The smell of the raw meat coated the back of my throat. I dug into the pile functioning on pure adrenaline-fueled necessity. I tossed frozen chunks of caribou out of the way, clearing a wide path down to the foundation of the shed. Helen reached the open doorway. She stood silhouetted against the gray Alaskan sky, panting heavily. The panic in her eyes had mutated into a wild, feral desperation. She screamed at me to get away from the feed. She told the trooper I was destroying her property and demanded he drag me off the premises. The officer stood in the doorway, his hand hovering near his radio, watching my frantic excavation. He informed Helen that I still possessed 6 minutes on the civil order, and I was legally permitted to locate my extreme weather gear. I threw the final sack of frozen salmon aside, exposing the bare floorboards in the corner of the shed. The wood had been carefully cut and modified. I dug my numb fingers into a small recessed groove and pulled up a 2-foot square section of the flooring. Beneath the false bottom, the truth sat encased in cold steel. It was a commercial-grade floor safe. The dark metal box was anchored directly into the concrete slab foundation of the outbuilding, utilizing thick industrial bolts. The digital keypad on top of the vault remained dark, waiting for an access code. I knelt on the dirt, staring at the steel surface. My chest heaved, pulling the freezing foul air into my lungs. I knew the physical shadow ledger detailing the intercepted state dividends lay resting inside that box. I knew the hoarded cash stolen from the native dog handlers was stacked tight beneath that keypad. The temptation to touch it, to pound my fists against the steel and scream my vindication to the trooper burned in my veins. But my corporate tax training anchored me to the rigid arithmetic of the law. If I touched that safe, if I attempted to pry it open or seize the physical box without a judicial warrant, any defense attorney would invoke the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. The evidence would be permanently tainted. A judge would throw the ledger out of court, citing an illegal search and seizure. The state prosecutor would lose the case, and I would still face a decade in prison. The law requires a sterile, unbroken chain of custody. I stood up, backing away from the exposed vault, leaving it resting in plain sight. I turned to face Helen, letting the unyielding reality of the steel safe speak for itself. Helen looked past my shoulder, staring down at the exposed vault. The foundation of her survival narrative fractured and collapsed. The impenetrable fortress she built to protect her son and her land was breached by the very woman she intended to sacrifice. The calculated territorial matriarch vanished, replaced by an animal backed into a corner. She had survived a whiteout blizzard by severing her humanity, and she reacted to this exposure with the exact same primal violence. She did not attempt to argue legal technicalities or offer a fabricated excuse to the officer. She lunged into the dim shed. She reached into a nearby open feed bucket and grabbed a solid, heavy slab of frozen salmon. The fish was rigid as a block of concrete carrying jagged edges of ice along its scales. She swung her arm in a wide, savage arc, aiming directly for my head. I raised my left arm instinctively to shield my face. The frozen salmon struck me hard across the shoulder and collarbone. The impact was jarring, sending a sharp, blinding wave of pain down my arm. The force of the blow knocked me off balance. I stumbled backward, tripping over a discarded burlap sack, and hit the hard dirt floor. My shoulder throbbed, radiating a deep, agonizing ache that clouded my vision. Helen stood over me, raising the frozen block of fish, preparing to bring it down again. She screamed that I would not take her dirt. The state trooper did not hesitate. The tedious civil standby transformed into an active, violent felony in a fraction of a second. The officer shouted a harsh command, stepping into the shed and drawing his service weapon. He did not wait for Helen to comply. He holstered the gun, grabbed the collar of her heavy winter coat, and tackled her, driving her backward through the open doorway. They hit the icy ground of the dog yard with a heavy thud. The huskies chained a few yards away escalated their howling lunging against their collars at the sudden commotion. The trooper rolled Helen onto her stomach, pressing his knee firmly between her shoulder blades. He pulled her arms behind her back, securing her wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. Helen thrashed against the frozen gravel, spitting and cursing, fighting the restraints with a raw, feral strength. I sat up in the dirt of the shed, clutching my bruised shoulder. I looked at the exposed steel safe and then out at the officer pinning Helen to the ground. The poetic justice of the moment was stark and undeniable. By assaulting me to protect the hidden vault, Helen had triggered her own execution. She had committed a felony assault in the direct presence of law enforcement. The feed shed was no longer a disputed marital storage space. It was now an active, secured crime scene. The trooper pulled his radio from his shoulder strap, requesting immediate backup and a medical unit. Then he looked at the steel safe bolted to the foundation. He requested a direct patch to the Financial Crimes Unit, stating he had located a concealed vault during a felony assault and required an immediate search warrant. The bureaucratic wall that trapped me for months crumbled into dust. The legal machinery I desperately needed was finally activated, not by my spreadsheets, but by Helen's own unchecked rage. I pulled myself up from the dirt, feeling the deep throbbing pain in my shoulder, realizing the trap had officially snapped shut. But the justice system requires a final devastating reckoning to close the ledger. The wait lasted precisely 4 hours. I sat in the heated passenger seat of a responding patrol cruiser parked near the edge of the driveway. An emergency medical technician had examined my shoulder, ruling out a fractured collarbone but wrapping my arm in a tight, restrictive sling. The deep, throbbing pain served as a constant biological anchor, keeping me grounded in the physical reality of the frozen yard. Through the windshield, I watched the outfitting lodge transform from a private sanctuary into a fortified staging area for the federal government. The assault provided the state prosecutor with the undeniable probable cause she demanded. A federal magistrate signed the targeted search warrant, authorizing a comprehensive breach of the feed shed. 3 black tactical vans rolled up the driveway, bypassing the main house entirely. Agents dressed in heavy winter gear unloaded heavy Pelican cases carrying industrial tools. The barking of the huskies grew erratic, the animals sensing the unfamiliar, aggressive machinery entering their territory. 2 agents escorted Helen out of the main house. She was no longer fighting the restraints. Her hands remained cuffed behind her back, and her posture was rigid. They positioned her near the side of the driveway, ensuring she maintained a clear view of the shed. David stood a few feet away, shivering in a thin jacket, entirely ignored by his mother and the surrounding officers. A loud, piercing, mechanical whine shattered the tension. Sparks showered from the open doorway of the outbuilding, illuminating the dim interior. The agents utilized a thermal cutting torch and heavy angle grinders to breach the commercial-grade steel of the floor safe. The smell of burning metal and ozone mixed with the foul odor of raw fish drifting out into the freezing air. The grinding lasted for 20 agonizing minutes before a heavy metallic clank signaled the surrender of the vault mechanism. The thick steel door was pried open, exposing the dark cavity anchored into the concrete foundation. The lead investigator, a man who had stared at my shivering frame with profound suspicion months ago, emerged from the shed holding 2 thick plastic evidence bags. He did not look at me or offer an apology. He walked over to the hood of the nearest patrol vehicle and set the bags down under the harsh glare of a portable halogen worklight. The contents of those bags represented the absolute destruction of Helen's empire. The first bag contained a heavy black leather-bound accounting journal. It was the physical shadow ledger the prosecution required. I watched the investigator snap on a pair of latex gloves and carefully flip open the heavy cover. Even from a distance, the structure of the pages was unmistakable. The ledger was organized with meticulous handwritten precision, mapping out the entire predatory company town scheme. The left column listed the employee identification numbers of the seasonal U-Pick dog handlers. The center column recorded the exact electronic routing numbers used to intercept their annual permanent fund dividend payouts. The right column provided the irrefutable evidence required to dismantle my forged signature. The entries detailed the immediate transfer of the stolen state funds into the lodge operating accounts disguised as retroactive housing garnishments. Every single fraudulent transfer was anchored by 2 distinct marks. David had signed his name on the authorization line, his sharp left-handed slant matching the forged internal slips perfectly. Directly beside his signature, sitting in the approval column, were Helen's dark, bold initials. The mother and son had meticulously documented their own joint felony, constructing an airtight paper trail, connecting them directly to the systemic identity theft and federal wire fraud. My printed spreadsheets were validated not by an argument, but by their own arrogant record-keeping. The second evidence bag held the tangible consequence of their greed. The investigator pulled out thick, dense bricks of physical currency. The money was wrapped tightly in heavy rubber bands, smelling of cold, damp paper. It was the hoarded cash skimmed from the lodge operations, sitting in the dark, waiting to fund Helen's rural legacy. The federal agents laid the banded stacks across the hood of the cruiser, cataloging hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen directly from the state treasury and the pockets of the vulnerable seasonal workers. The irrefutable proof of their profound selfishness was laid bare on the freezing metal, reflecting in the strobing red and blue lights of the police vehicles. I opened the door of the patrol cruiser and stepped out onto the slushy gravel. The biting wind whipped across my face, but I did not feel the cold. I walked slowly down the driveway, keeping my injured arm held tight against my chest. I approached the cluster of agents and stopped a few feet away from Helen. Helen stared at the open evidence bags resting on the hood of the car. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale ashen gray. The formidable matriarch who dragged her son through a lethal blizzard and built a fortress with her bare hands was gone. The survival instinct that pushed her to sacrifice me to protect her dirt had finally run out of options. She looked at the heavy black ledger, realizing the sacred legacy she compromised her soul to protect was officially erased. The federal government would seize the land, liquidate the assets, and dismantle the outfitting business board by board. David finally broke the silence. He stepped forward, his voice cracking as he looked at the stacks of currency. He started to speak, attempting to build a frantic, cowardly excuse, claiming he was only following his mother's instructions. He looked toward me, his eyes wide and pleading, searching for the empathetic wife he had tried to trap with a wire just hours ago. Helen did not let him finish. She turned her head slowly, locking her cold, dark eyes onto her son. The look she gave him was not maternal. It was a gaze of pure, unfiltered disgust. She had sacrificed her integrity and weaponized her family to preserve the lodge. She had expected him to match her ruthlessness. Instead, he crumbled under the pressure, wearing a wire and whining to the authorities. She did not yell or curse. She simply turned away from him, severing the bloodline bond right there in the freezing slush. She realized he was entirely unworthy of the empire she bled for. I looked at David, watching the devastating realization crush his remaining spirit. He threw away our marriage for a mother who despised his weakness. He was left with nothing but impending federal charges and profound isolation. I turned and walked past Helen. I did not offer a gloating remark or a sharp cinematic one-liner. I did not need to scream my vindication into the Alaskan night. The heavy black ledger resting on the hood of the patrol car spoke louder than any insult I could manufacture. The absolute silence between us cemented the permanent shift in power. I reached my damaged silver vehicle, pulled open the heavy door, and slid onto the cold seat. The justice system finally possessed the physical tools required to exact a brutal, methodical vengeance. But the grinding bureaucratic process of a federal conviction carries its own distinct, agonizing weight, and the slow demolition of my former family was only just beginning. The grinding gears of the criminal justice system usually move with agonizing slowness, dragging defendants through months of procedural delays. But the discovery of the physical shadow ledger inside the outfitting lodge feed shed acted as a potent chemical catalyst. The local state prosecutor took one look at the authenticated banking routing numbers and the forged employee signatures. She immediately relinquished jurisdiction. The crime crossed banking lines, involved the systemic theft of government disbursements, and utilized the Postal Service for fraudulent mailings. The United States Attorney assumed total control of the investigation, elevating the charges to the federal level. 3 weeks after the raid in the frozen dog yard, a federal judge signed a formal dismissal order. My criminal indictment was officially erased. The civil asset forfeiture binding my bank accounts evaporated overnight. I left the damp, freezing dry cabin in the Goldstream Valley forever and drove south to the coastal city of Anchorage. The federal building in downtown Anchorage is a towering modern structure of reinforced glass and polished gray granite. It overlooks the dark, churning waters of the Cook Inlet, projecting cold, impenetrable authority. I sat inside a sprawling deposition room on the 14th floor. The climate control maintained a perfect, comfortable temperature, a stark contrast to the bitter wind of the interior. I wore a tailored navy suit, the structured fabric feeling unfamiliar but deeply empowering after months of surviving in borrowed wool and heavy canvas. My shoulder still carried a dull ache from the frozen salmon strike, but I no longer required the restrictive medical sling. I sat on one side of a long, polished mahogany table, resting my hands on the smooth wood. I was no longer a shivering, destitute suspect, locked out in the snow on Christmas Eve. I was the primary forensic witness for the federal government. Across the wide expanse of the dark wood sat Helen and David. The transition from their sprawling rural territory to the sterile, rigid environment of federal court stripped them of their formidable aura. They looked incredibly small. Helen appeared pale and diminished. She wore a plain gray blouse, her weathered, calloused hands resting flat and still against the table. The territorial matriarch, who wielded a rifle and commanded a howling pack of huskies, did not exist in this room. The wilderness she relied upon to intimidate her enemies could not penetrate the thick glass windows of the 14th floor. Beside her, David sat hunched over, staring intently at his expensive leather shoes. He looked terrified, his shoulders shaking with a quiet, rhythmic tremor. They were flanked by 3 high-priced defense attorneys holding thick legal pads. The lawyers did not exude the typical arrogance of their profession. They sweated under the recessed fluorescent lighting, shuffling through thick stacks of printed evidence boxes. They were reading the high-resolution copies of the shadow ledger, realizing their clients were legally doomed. The lead federal prosecutor, a calm older man wearing wire-rimmed glasses, initiated the proffer session. He did not raise his voice or pound his fist. He simply asked me to guide the defense counsel through the precise architecture of the fraud. He wanted the opposing lawyers to understand the inescapable depth of the evidence before they even attempted to draft a negotiation. I opened my black binder. I did not smile. I did not lean forward and deliver a triumphant cinematic monologue dripping with manufactured venom. My voice carried the heavy, exhausted weight of a survivor who had spent the entire winter dragging her life out of a frozen grave. I spoke the clinical, unyielding language of forensic mathematics. I detailed the predatory company-town scheme Helen engineered from the ground up. I explained how her arrogance blinded her to standard audit procedures. She relied on a shadow economy, intercepting the permanent fund dividends of vulnerable native teenagers because she believed the rural isolation of her lodge placed her above the law. I explained that she viewed her own seasonal employees as disposable fuel meant to keep her rural empire burning. I pointed toward the copies of the shadow ledger, resting directly in front of her attorneys. I noted the specific dates where David forged the internal transfer authorizations, and Helen applied her verifying initials. I explained how they utilized my professional accounting license as a convenient shield, assuming a city accountant would never dig into the muddy, brutal reality of the dog-yard feed budget. I looked directly at Helen. She kept her jaw locked, refusing to break eye contact, but her eyes lacked their former lethal spark. I told her the outfitting lodge did not fall because an outsider attacked it. It fell because her legendary survival instinct mutated into unhinged greed. She thought the harsh land required constant sacrifice, but she was only feeding her own profound selfishness. She built a complex legal trap designed to send an innocent woman to federal prison simply to balance her stolen checkbook. I kept my voice steady and low, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of a gavel. I told her she failed to calculate one vital variable. When you lock a licensed corporate accountant in a freezing cabin and strip away her entire future, you force her to examine the math of her own destruction. I told Helen she engineered her own ruin by leaving a handwritten paper trail born of pure arrogance. One of the defense attorneys attempted to interject, raising a weak procedural objection regarding my characterization of the events. The federal prosecutor silenced him instantly with a single raised hand, allowing me to continue without interruption. I turned my attention away from the mother and focused entirely on the son. David kept his eyes glued to the carpet, refusing to look up. I did not let him hide in the periphery. I spoke his name, demanding his attention. His head snapped up, his eyes swimming with the same fabricated tears he used when he visited my cabin. He tried to project the image of a manipulated victim, a naive boy caught in the gravitational pull of a domineering mother. I methodically dismantled his pathetic weeping facade. I forced him to look me directly in the eye while I stripped away his manufactured innocence piece by piece. I reminded him of the blinking red light hidden beneath the thick canvas collar of his jacket. I told the room that a true victim does not wear a concealed audio transmitter to extract a false confession from his freezing, destitute wife. I explained that he was never a captive of his mother's paranoia. He was a willing, eager participant who forged government documents and stole from impoverished teenagers to fund his rugged outdoorsman aesthetic. I told him he eroded the foundation of his own family through profound cowardice. He sacrificed a loyal partner to appease a mother who now looked at him with unmistakable disgust. David let out a ragged, sobbing gasp, burying his face in his trembling hands. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet deposition room. Helen did not reach out to comfort him. She did not offer a word of reassurance. She shifted her heavy leather chair slightly away from him, cementing the physical and emotional death of their bloodline. She realized his weakness had accelerated their downfall. The defense attorneys stopped shuffling their papers. They closed their legal pads and clicked their pens shut, recognizing the stark reality of the room. The mechanical jaws of the trap Helen built had reversed direction and snapped shut on her own wrists. They possessed zero remaining leverage. They could not threaten me with a grueling jury trial because my pristine spreadsheets were now backed by their own handwritten ledgers and the seized physical currency. They could not negotiate a gentle surrender or request house arrest because the federal government does not offer leniency to unrepentant predators who exploit state funds. The lead prosecutor closed his own file folder, signaling the end of the deposition. He informed the defense counsel that the United States would not accept any plea deals preserving the outfitting lodge property. The land would be seized. The stolen funds would be repatriated. The only item left to discuss was the length of their impending incarceration. I closed my black binder and stood up from the mahogany table. I walked out of the sterile room, leaving them to suffocate in the silence of their own making. The grueling investigation was finally over. The only event remaining was the cold, heavy judgment of the sentencing phase. The climax arrived 6 weeks later inside the towering federal courthouse in downtown Anchorage. I sat in the second row of the heavy oak gallery, the polished wood cold against my back. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and aged paper. The massive seal of the United States hung directly behind the elevated bench, projecting an aura of absolute finality. The room was packed with local journalists, state auditors, and several of the young native dog handlers who had traveled from remote villages to witness the conclusion. I wore my tailored navy suit, keeping my hands resting quietly in my lap. I did not sit near the prosecution table. My role as the primary forensic witness was concluded. I was merely an observer watching the heavy blade of the justice system fall. Helen and David sat at the defense table, their backs stiff under the harsh overhead lighting. The grueling federal process had entirely stripped them of their rugged rural armor. Helen wore a shapeless beige jumpsuit issued by the Federal Detention Center. Her gray hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. She looked hollowed out, the deep lines of her face etched with exhaustion and defeated pride. Beside her, David wore a poorly fitting gray suit, his shoulders slumped in a posture of total surrender. They did not attempt to fight the inevitable. Facing an airtight case built upon their own authenticated shadow ledgers and millions of dollars in seized currency, their high-priced attorneys negotiated a formal guilty plea to avoid a lengthy, catastrophic trial. The presiding federal judge, a stern woman with decades of experience handling complex financial crimes, struck her heavy wooden gavel. She did not waste time with introductory pleasantries. She addressed the defendants directly, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. She formally accepted their guilty pleas regarding multiple counts of severe federal wire fraud, systemic identity theft, and corporate tax evasion. The judge outlined the sheer predatory nature of their company town scheme, describing how they targeted vulnerable young workers, relying on the isolation of the interior to mask their theft of state funds. The sentencing phase commenced with brutal efficiency. The judge mandated Helen to serve a firm term of 7 years in a medium-security federal penitentiary, highlighting her role as the primary architect of the fraud. David received a lighter but still devastating sentence of 4 years, citing his complicity and his active role in forging the government documents. The prison sentences were substantial, locking them both in federal cages for years. But the true climax, the ultimate devastating payoff, did not involve concrete cells or steel bars. It arrived when the judge shifted the focus from criminal incarceration to financial restitution. Helen had built her entire survival narrative around the physical property of the outfitting lodge. She had dragged her toddler son through a lethal blizzard, sacrificing her own flesh and severing her humanity to secure the land. She believed the sprawling acres, the heavy timber cabins, and the howling dog yards constituted a sacred legacy that justified any level of deceit. She framed me and intended to send me to prison solely to preserve that dirt. The judge picked up a thick stack of finalized asset forfeiture documents and delivered the fatal blow. The federal magistrate ordered the immediate permanent seizure of the entire outfitting lodge operation. She ruled that the millions of dollars in untaxed profit generated by the property were inextricably linked to the stolen permanent fund dividends. She mandated a swift federal auction to liquidate the sprawling acreage, the heavy equipment, and the main lodge buildings. She decreed that the resulting millions in auction proceeds would not be absorbed by the state treasury. The funds were placed into a strict managed trust. The trust was legally ordered to distribute the massive wealth directly to the dozens of young Native Alaskan employees Helen had systematically exploited over the past decade. Helen was forced to stand and listen to the final ruling. The judge decreed that the sacred land she bled for, the territory she considered her personal kingdom, was being legally handed over to the exact people she viewed as disposable resources. The vulnerable workers she preyed upon were now the rightful financial beneficiaries of her life's work. The empire she killed her soul to protect was entirely gone. A collective, quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Several of the native handlers sitting near the back row nodded silently, the profound gravity of the restitution settling over the room. I watched Helen absorb the ruling. She did not weep. She did not collapse or scream her defiance at the judge. She stood perfectly still, a terrifying hollow rigidity taking over her posture. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale ashen mask. The realization that she had destroyed her own legacy through her unhinged greed paralyzed her completely. She had fought off aggressive corporate investors and lethal Arctic blizzards only to hand the deed of her property directly to the federal government. Two heavily armed United States Marshals stepped forward, approaching the defense table. They commanded Helen and David to place their hands behind their backs. The harsh metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the silent courtroom, sealing their fate. As the marshals secured the restraints, a sudden raw display of poetic justice unfolded right in front of the judge. David turned his head toward his mother. The reality of the 4-year federal prison sentence finally shattered his remaining composure. He began to weep openly, his shoulders shaking with ragged, heavy sobs. He sought the protective maternal instinct he had relied upon his entire life. He desperately sought reassurance, looking for the fierce matriarch who would tell him everything was going to be all right. He reached his cuffed hands awkwardly toward her, seeking a final tether of comfort before they were separated by the penal system. Helen did not offer a word of comfort. She did not lean toward him or speak a quiet motherly blessing. She turned her head and glared at her son. Her eyes burned with pure, unfiltered disgust. The maternal bond was entirely eradicated, replaced by the venom of a defeated warlord. She looked at his weeping face and the trembling of his shoulders. She did not blame the federal prosecutor or the judge for her ruin. She blamed him. She called him a pathetic, weak coward. She hissed the insult through gritted teeth, stating he failed to protect the property because he lacked the spine to finish the job. She blamed him for wearing the wire and accelerating their downfall, confirming that his weakness was the ultimate vulnerability in her fortress. David stopped weeping, his jaw dropping in stunned horror. His entire world shattered in that singular, devastating moment. He realized the absolute totality of his miscalculation. He had sacrificed a wife who genuinely loved him, a woman who would have fought beside him to balance the books and save the business. He threw away a solid marriage and his own freedom to protect a mother who now openly despised his weakness. He traded everything for a woman who viewed him not as a beloved son, but as a failed, incompetent employee. The marshals grabbed their arms, leading them away through the heavy wooden side doors. David stumbled his head, hanging low, entirely broken by the rejection. Helen walked with a rigid, mechanical stiffness, never looking back at her son. I sat in the gallery watching the heavy doors swing shut behind them. The dramatic payoff was comprehensive and legally permanent. The predatory abusers were locked away, and the exploited victims received immense financial restitution. The audience around me began to stand their quiet conversations, filling the courtroom with a sense of resolved tension. But sitting in the second row, I did not feel a sudden victorious thrill. There was no triumphant surge of adrenaline or cinematic joy. I felt a heavy, quiet void settling deep into my chest. The toxic tissue was finally permanently excised from my life, but the surgery had left a deep, profound scar. I had survived the freezing cold and dismantled the trap, but the process had incinerated my marriage and my former reality. I stood up from the oak bench, smoothing the fabric of my tailored navy suit, knowing the true challenge was not destroying the past, but figuring out how to build a future from the ashes. Late May arrives in the Alaskan interior, not with a gentle, gradual thaw, but with a severe structural fracture. Locals refer to this chaotic transition as breakup season. The deep winter ice covering the rivers does not melt quietly. It groans and cracks under the rising pressure of the spring runoff. Huge, jagged slabs of ice collide and pile along the riverbanks, scraping the bark off ancient spruce trees. The frozen ground gives way, turning the unplowed roads into treacherous trenches of thick brown mud. It is a messy period of transition where the pristine white blanket of winter dissolves, revealing the dark, submerged dirt beneath. The season served as a perfect, unyielding reflection of my own life. The rigid, frozen architecture of my marriage had fractured under intense pressure, leaving behind a public collapse. But underneath the mud and the broken ice, the ground was finally solid. I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, located on the 10th floor of a modern high-rise in downtown Anchorage. I turned the brushed nickel faucet, watching the clean, steaming hot water pour into the stainless steel sink. I held my hands under the stream, letting the heat soak into my skin. The simple act of washing a coffee cup felt like an immense luxury. There were no freezing plastic jugs to haul from a distant valley spring. There was no rotten birchwood to split in the pitch-black cold. The building featured secure electronic locks on every door and a heated underground parking garage. The hostile elements of the territory were locked outside where they belonged. I dried my hands on a fresh cotton towel, looking out the large glass window toward the snow-capped peak of Mount Susitna. My physical environment no longer demanded a daily grueling fight for basic biological survival. The state licensing board had reviewed the sealed federal transcripts and the authenticated shadow ledgers recovered from the dog yard vault. Recognizing the sheer depth of the frame up the board, issued a formal written apology and reinstated my professional credentials with a pristine record. I was a licensed corporate tax accountant once again, but my clientele had fundamentally shifted. I no longer protected the hoarded wealth of rural outfitters attempting to hide their illicit assets from the government. I operated out of a sleek corner office, auditing the ledgers for legitimate, community-focused native corporations. These organizations utilize strict financial oversight to build regional health clinics, fund rural scholarships, and construct reliable infrastructure in remote coastal villages. My mathematics were no longer a shield for deceit. They were tools used to build a future. This morning, I finalized a highly specific set of corporate documents. A group of young native dog handlers, led by a quiet Yupik teenager named Thomas, had pooled the substantial funds they received from the Federal Restitution Trust. They did not waste their settlement. They formed a legal cooperative and attended the government foreclosure auction. They purchased the sprawling outfitting lodge, the heavy equipment, and the surrounding acreage for a fraction of its former market value. They legally owned the dirt Helen had bled for. Thomas hired my accounting firm to serve as their primary financial oversight. I sat across from him in my office, handing him the binding corporate charter that established him as the president of the cooperative. I used my signature to build a legal fortress for the very victims Helen tried to erase. The poetic symmetry of the transaction provided a quiet, profound satisfaction. I left my apartment and took the elevator down to the polished marble lobby. I unlocked my brass mailbox and pulled out a small stack of envelopes. Most were routine utility bills and professional correspondence. Tucked near the bottom of the stack was a cheap, thin envelope made of coarse, recycled paper. I recognized the sharp, left-handed slant of the penmanship immediately. The ink pressed hard into the paper, revealing the frantic, desperate energy of the sender. In the top left corner, a red ink stamp identified the origin point as a low-security federal correctional institution located in rural Oregon. Below the return address sat a stark 9-digit inmate identification number. David had spent the last 5 months sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of his flannel aesthetic and his mother's dominant protection. He was reaching out across the miles, attempting to cast a lifeline back to the woman he had betrayed. The envelope likely contained pages of weeping apologies, manufactured regret, and hollow promises. He likely wanted forgiveness or a simple tether to the outside world to ease his profound isolation. I stood in the bright lobby, holding the federal letter. I did not feel a sudden agonizing pull of empathy. I did not experience a dramatic internal debate regarding redemption or closure. My heart rate remained steady and calm. The man who wore a concealed audio transmitter to extract my false confession no longer existed in my reality. He was a ghost from a previous freezing life. I walked across the lobby toward the resident business center. A heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sat next to a communal printer. I did not break the seal on the envelope. I did not read a single desperate syllable of his apology. I pressed the power button, listening to the steel blades hum to life. I fed the unopened letter directly into the narrow feed slot. The machine grabbed the cheap paper, shredding his words, his handwriting, and his memory into tiny, illegible strips. The noise was loud, mechanical, and entirely final. I turned off the machine and walked away, leaving his hollow remorse resting in the plastic waste bin. I required no further answers from a coward. I walked down to the heated garage and got into my car. I drove out of the city, heading south down the Seward Highway. The road winds along the edge of the Turnagain Arm, a breathtaking stretch of coastline where the towering Chugach Mountains drop sharply into the dark, churning waters of the inlet. The sky above was a brilliant, piercing blue, clear of any impending storm fronts. I pressed the button on the door panel, rolling the driver's side window all the way down. The wind rushed into the cabin, carrying the crisp, salty scent of the coastal tide, mixing with the fragrant smell of early blooming fireweed. I pressed my foot against the accelerator, feeling the steady, reliable power of the engine. I looked out at the water, watching a pod of white beluga whales breach the surface in the distance. I did not walk away from the nightmare with a staggering lottery payout or a fairy tale romance. The justice system did not offer a magical, lucrative reward for surviving a brutal criminal trap. But I won something far more resilient than money or revenge. I won my unyielding independence. I restored my professional integrity, securing a career that allowed me to sleep soundly at night without fearing the sound of approaching sirens. I forged a fierce self-reliance born from hauling freezing water in the dark and dismantling a predator with nothing but a pen and a spreadsheet. I took a deep breath of the ocean air, letting the freezing wind whip through my hair. The crushing weight of joint liability and manipulated family loyalty was gone. The long, dark winter of my life was finally over. The ice was broken, and the road ahead was entirely mine.